Part 2, major prophetic signs of the second coming of Christ. I posted the first one on Facebook. Hopefully you was able to send that out on y'all's Facebook wall, but some informative stuff. I had a lot of good, already started to have some good comments on it from first night I posted it. I started having several people comment on it. And so that's good. I'm glad to see people looking at it. Major prophetic signs of the second coming of Christ. And we're talking now, I said part 1, but I meant to say part 2. And it is part 2. Let me find it. I've got a lot of slides on this thing. There it is. All right, part 2. Take good notes. If you got a little note card, we want you to take good notes, and we're going to talk about a few things. We talked about some things last week, and you all remember what they were. Talking about Israel per se, persecution, and Jews coming back into their land, and some informative stuff. Definitely write these verses down. Keep them in your Bible. Bookmark your spot. Matter of fact, you could staple this to the last week's bulletin and keep these going, because a lot of stuff that I'm giving you over the next couple of weeks, we're going to get into the blood moon starting in the first week of March. These things that I'm giving you right now, though, is really interesting because you can use these, and it's going to cover a lot of stuff that I would even cover with people that are searching. Okay. First thing, this is actually number 3, but it's the first thing tonight. This is number 3 from the ongoing message. This is part 2 of major prophetic signs of the second coming of Christ. So you had 1 and 2 last week, starting tonight with number 3. Third thing, Israel is the fig tree promised in the last days. I told you I would speak about this. These are actual places that you're going to be able to take people to and show them why Israel really is the fig tree. It's compared to a fig tree. Why is that important? Some of you all know why it's important. In the Gospel of Matthew, it talks about it. Israel is the fig tree promised in the last days. Matthew on the screen, verses 32 through 35. We're going to read this. It says, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves." So, needless to say, we're starting off with the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is telling, these are Jesus's words. He says, now learn this parable. He's telling us to learn it. Okay, so if it's not, real quick, just throw this out there as a freebie. If the end times isn't important, okay, if it's not important, it don't really matter. He's going to come back when he comes back. You know people that kind of, then why does Jesus say learn? Okay, perfect example. Why does he tell us to learn? Matter of fact, this whole, people could say, well, he's talking about a fig tree. He's talking about the end times. Well, this whole chapter is about the end times. Matthew 24. From verse 1 on, it's about the end times. So when Jesus says learn this, he's wanting us to learn something. That's him telling us. That's how important it is. Okay? Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near. When you see all these things, what are all these things? Okay? That's a good question to ask yourself. So when you see all these things, know that it is near. I'll tell you what the answer is. All these things in verse 33 equates to everything, all the signs. From verse 1, because he's in Matthew 24. From verse 1, when the disciples said, Jesus, when Jesus was showing them the temples, the temple and all the buildings, and they said, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus said, he spoke about the signs. These are all these things. Exactly. It says, know that it is near at the doors. Now look at verse 34. Surely I say to you, this generation. So you ask the question. You ask the question, what is this generation? It says this generation. He's speaking about a particular group, a particular time. Well, actually a particular time, because a generation is speaking of time. not a group. Because it's going to be saved and unsaved alike. It's going to be part of that generation. He's speaking about a time. Surely I say to you, this generation, this timing, will by no means pass away till all, there it is again. So you all these things, go back to verse 33, all these things. So surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. All the signs from verse 1 on will take place before that generation, that time, passes away. Verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Learn a lesson from the fig tree. We're still talking about the fig tree. Okay, so look at Hosea chapter 9, verse 10 behind me. Write that down. Important chapter and verse. Hosea, the prophet Hosea says in verse 10, when I found Israel, it was like finding grapes in the desert. Okay? When I saw your fathers, it was like seeing the early fruit on the fig tree. The fathers of Israel, when I saw your fathers, it was like seeing the early fruit on the fig tree. The fig tree representing Israel, the fathers representing the fruit. Right? When the branch is tender, puts forth leaves. Matthew 24, verse 32. Now look at Joel behind me. Chapter 1, verses 6 through 7. It says, for a nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. This is an end-time chapter. His teeth are the teeth of a lion, and he has the fangs of a fierce lion. Verse 7, he has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. There it is again. And I could take you to Deuteronomy. There's many places in Scripture that speak about the fig tree. So he has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. Verse 32 of Matthew, remember what it said? Right there. Learn a lesson from the parable from the fig tree when it's, Jesus telling us to learn, when its branch has already become tender, there's the vine, and puts forth leaves. It's producing. Then Hosea talks about, when I saw your fathers, was like seeing the early fruit on the fig tree. It's producing. Verse 7 of Joel chapter 1 says, and he laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. He has stripped it bare and thrown it away. Its branches are made white. It's all stripped. Branches are white. All the fruit's gone. What has happened in the most recent past? Remember when all the Jews was expelled out of the land, right? The fig tree was laid bare. Not until, you all remember the graph I had? It's actually in my PowerPoint slides here, way up. But remember the graph, how it started building after 1948? Started really ramping up. Went from about, what, 800,000 to 8 million in 65 years. He has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. He has stripped it bare and thrown it away. Its branches are made white. Another place in Jeremiah 24. I'm going to take you there. Verse 1. Jeremiah 24, verse 1. God specifically tells us that the figs are referring to Israel. Here it is. The Lord showed me, and behold, 2 baskets of figs were set before the temple of the Lord. After that, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away captive Jeconiah, the son of Joachim, king of Judah, and the princes of Judah with carpenters and smiths from Jerusalem, and had brought them to Babylon. Okay? The parable of the fig tree is one of the prime roots of the parable, of this parable. Look at what it says again. The Lord showed me, and behold, 2 baskets of figs were set before the temple of the Lord. It was this wasn't a parable. This was a vision that God had showed Jeremiah. After that, after the vision of the 2 baskets of figs set before the temple of the Lord, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away captive Jeconiah, the son of Joachim in Judah, and the princes of Judah with the carpenters and smiths from Jerusalem, and had brought them to Babylon. 2 groups. There's 2 groups, right? 2 baskets of figs, the fruit from the fig tree. Joel talks about being laid bare. Several places in the Old Testament affirm that Israel is the fig tree of the Lord. Okay? So when you go back to this particular verse behind me, assuredly, it's pretty important when Jesus says assuredly. It's pretty sure. I mean, it's definite. It's going to happen. He says, I say to you, this generation. See how important this is, how easy it is to understand this. This generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. From verse 1 all the way to the end of Matthew 24, he says, this generation will by no means take place. The generation that sees the fig tree become tender and puts forth leaves. Okay, it's Matthew 24. The generation that sees that will not pass away. Brenda, I've always said this, she's faithful in Bible study and church. She is part of that generation. She was born in 1948. Okay? She's part of that generation. Now, I was born in 1969. Am I part of that generation? No, because I didn't see it. Brenda was alive in that year. She was part of that generation. So understand this, a person that's born in that time, that means there's people on this earth right now. But understand this too, that generation is definitely getting older, correct? So if the word, and I say this very half-heartedly, meaning that I don't buy into this, but if that generation, if people think that it's not that generation, then what is Christ referring to when he says, learn this parable from the fig tree? Okay, so I'm going to learn about the fig tree. What is Jesus even getting to when he tells me to look at the fig tree, when its branch is tender, puts forth the leaves, know that summer's near. Okay, I can tell that. Springtime, it's getting close, or we're in the springtime. The trees are blooming and budding. So you also, when you see all these things, okay, I look behind me and all the signs that are happening in this world, it says, know that it is near at the door. What's at the door? What's near? Jesus' return. Assuredly, I say to you, verse 34 behind me, this generation will by no means. What is he referring to when he says, why is he being so direct? It's not a guessing game. People have a hard time. Oh, Jesus is not going to come back in my lifetime. This is not a hard thing to comprehend. He's referring to a particular time. And it happens to be the time that people will witness the fig tree blossom. It's cut and dry. It's simple. People just knew their history. They would be in this church. They would be saved. They would be going somewhere. It says it right here, plain as the nose on my face. Surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away. Jesus said it, by no means will that generation pass away until all the things take place. Matthew 24 talks about the return of Christ. So it has to happen before this generation that sees the blossoming fig tree is gone, is dead, passed on, asleep, moved on. It's got to happen. It's got to happen. Amen? That's good news. Now, what is the generation? We talked about the fig tree. Now, what is the generation? Psalms 90 verse 1 says this, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Okay? So what is a biblical generation the Bible speaks of in verse 34? This generation, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. I've shared this before with you guys. Psalms 90 verse 1, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Psalms 90 starts off. The reason I put verse 1 is, which I've never shared that with you guys, as I was studying it, I started with verse 1 because I wanted to read it in context. Psalms 90 starts off dealing with a subject. The subject is God being with us through all generations. Generations is spoke of in the book of Psalms, first verse. It's important. He's getting the message to us. He's talking about generations. you go to verse 10 of Psalms 90 behind me, it says this. The days of our lives, remember we're dealing with generations, the days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years. Yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. Time is short, life passes us by, right? Their boast is only labor and sorrow. You work through your life, you got sorrow through your life. There's a lot of misery in life. There's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of good times too, but he's just letting us know our lives are labor and sorrow. Labor and sorrow. Since the fall of Adam and Eve, labor and sorrow. That's part of it. Let me bring you to one point. I think it's fascinating, very prophetic. Now, some of you all know about longevity, okay? I want you to think about something for a second. When you see that verse, it says in verse 10, the days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years. Do you know during the time this was written, okay, in Psalms, before the aquasphere was burst, right? You know, we know of Methuselah. There's a lot of people who lived a long time, okay? But knowing this is going to have to be in the latter days, the latter times, this particular chapter and verse that's going to have to equate to when Jesus returns, what is a biblical generation. They lived a long time back then. Now you have people back in Jesus' times that was living to about 40 years old, 45. That was the lifespan, right? In the Wild West days, the 17 and 1800s, 30 some odd years, 40 years. How? Well, I know how, but I'm going to use this sarcastically, so to speak, this statement. How does the Bible even know that at the end of days, when it's all culminates to the end, how did he know it was going to be 70 and 80 years, the longevity of most humans? Does that make sense? You're talking thousands of years of history, and they just pulled out of the air 70 and 80 years. There's something very prophetic happening here. And look at the time frame we're living in right now, and what's the life expectancy of people now? Between 70 and 80 years. That's it. Some people outlive that, some people don't make it. But the average is between 70 and 80 years with modern medicines. That's the life expectancy. Now think about that for a second. Just think about that. 100 years ago wasn't the case. It was a lot younger. But he used that. Does everybody see this? This is fascinating to me. When I was putting this together, I'm thinking, out of any time in history, it has to be right now that chapter and verse in Psalms 90, verse 10, has to be fulfilled, because this is the moment of history that we're living in when the longevity of people are 70 and 80 years, right? The average of all people on the face of the planet, 70 to 80 years. That's the average. Some people are in and out of that. But check that out. The days of our lives are 70, 80 years. And by reason of strength, they are 80 years. Yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. You see that? Now, that can mean a lot of different things. That's right. There's songs, the old hymn, I fly away. That right there is what I'm looking at it very prophetically. Labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Yeah. Yeah. Some people will look at that and say, well, that means they're going to die and we fly away. Yeah, I get that. But also to the believer, I'm looking at it in the New Testament, very prophetic, blood-bought saint of the Most High God. We're going to be cut. It's going to be cut off for us. The end, the Bible says, if unless those days were shortened, it's going to be shortened, and then we'll fly away. We'll be taking up to heaven, taking up to meet Jesus in the clouds. Amen. See, I look at that verse very prophetically. And I think about the timing right now is impeccable for that verse to be realized. I mean, for that chapter and verse to be realized in the sense 70, 80 years. Look at history. I'm telling you, 100 years ago, I can go down to the cemetery, my local cemetery, and I can just read tombstones. And back in the late 1700s and 1800s, I see and a lot of people were young. It's just the way things were. I mean, now we're in a time frame of our lives, 70, 80 years. This is the moment. We are in that generation. This is it. This is it. as the fellow said, we're at the home stretch. It's the last leg of the race. I believe the anchor of the race is running, right? Okay. So we see Israel is the fig tree promised in the last days. That's number 3. Remember, we're picking up with number 3 this week. Number 4, we talked about the fig tree and we talked about a generation. Number 4, Jerusalem will be in Jewish hands. It's very prophetic as well. Jerusalem will be in Jewish hands. Luke 21:24 behind me. It says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Now, here's something that's very fascinating. I've said to you many times in this assembly that Jerusalem, people think that God's always going to defend Israel even in the last days. That is true. The remnant will be kept. Judah will remain. But I told you, Israel's almost going to be annihilated at the very last. It's going to be almost annihilated. And unless those days are cut short, no flesh would be saved. This is that verse. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Okay? It's close. I mean, the desolation's coming. A great battle's ensuing. That's prophetic because we're into that moment now where allegiances have started to happen. Over the last month, things are clicking away. And a year ago, wasn't possible. And now the puzzle pieces are lining up. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance. It talks about entering her. Revelation 17, Brenda's very familiar with that chapter and verse, talks about the woman clothed with the stars. That's Israel. That's her. Let not those who are in the country enter her. Verse 22, for these are the days of vengeance. Vengeance of what? You may want to take a stab at it. The wrath of God. Remember I told you I'm pre-wrath. The wrath of God's going to come right before that happens. I believe the rapture takes place. For these days are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. There's one of the reasons. There's another verse for it. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. The wrath of God. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Jerusalem is going to be taken again. It's going to happen. But there'll be a remnant saved through it all. You got to understand, in the last days, the Antichrist is going to be, his capital is Jerusalem. That's where he's going to be doing his business from. His office is going to be there. That's it. This is a spiritual battle taking place. That's why Zechariah chapter 14 declares it, where it says that Jerusalem is becoming it will be the cup of trembling to all the world. It'll be a cup of drunkenness. That the people of the world will be getting drunk off Jerusalem. And there will be trembling, a cup of fear. Jerusalem will be a cup of fear to the whole world. Jerusalem. Think about that for a second. See, many people believe that this prophecy has already been fulfilled. Remember the 6-Day War? Remember the 6-Day War? This thing. You remember June of 67. Israel claims, these are actual Washington Post and New York Times. Israel claims major land, air gains, hope for U.S.-Soviet agreement rises. New York Times, Israelis rout the Arabs, approach the Suez, break blockade, occupy old Jerusalem. Remember I told you they took back Jerusalem in 67. In 48, they didn't have Jerusalem. They had Israel. They didn't have Jerusalem. 67 is when they took Jerusalem. Agree to UN ceasefire. United Arab Emirates rejects it. That's not the UAE. I don't even know who that is. United Nations ceasefire. UAR rejects it. Something Arab. United Arab. I'm not sure what it R stands for. So we see that The 6-day war happened. Israel routed the enemy, and they took the old Jerusalem. That's why Obama right now wants Israel to go back to pre-1967 borders. Remember that thing I showed you last week? The slide? Okay? So people think this has already been accomplished here. The time of the Gentiles. That's what they think that's already happened. But I'll say it this way. I'm not in that camp. Most Bible scholars, essentially, most people will teach you that that's happened 1967 of June. I don't believe that. I believe because we're still in the time of the Gentiles. There's unbelievers that still occupy Jerusalem, and they're still fighting over Jerusalem. And until Jesus comes and sets his foot down on the Mount of Olives, that this is the time of the Gentiles are still upon us. Matter of fact, they're going to surround Jerusalem pretty soon, right? And they're going to lay it desolate. That's the time of the Gentiles. That's just common sense to me. I believe that this is an ongoing fulfilling verse. Fulfilling prophecy. It's ongoing, like I talked about last week. It's ongoing. Zechariah chapter 12. I said chapter 14. It was chapter 12 I meant. It says, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. There it is. And it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all the nations of the earth are gathered against it. So we know the time of the Gentiles are going to consummate when all the nations are going to come against Jerusalem. That is when Christ comes back, okay? The way it's going to play out, Christ will come back to declare his kingdom upon this earth. He sets his foot down on the Mount of Olives. The battle of Armageddon happens. Okay? That is after the rapture. The battle of Armageddon happens at the moment Christ comes to set up his kingdom. That's when the battle happens. Yes. Thank you. United Arab Republic. I knew it was Arab something, United Arab something. I just didn't know. Thank you, Les. So we see that when he sets his foot down on Mount Olives, the battle ensues immediately. Okay? City is going to be laid desolate because the army is going to be gathered against her. Bad things are happening to Jerusalem. And you ever notice this year, you ever notice how the news is progressing, that everything, it seems like Jerusalem is hotly contested about everything anymore? When you watch national news, think about it. I mean, I just want you to think about Jerusalem for a second. Jerusalem's not a very big city at all, very, very small. But I want you to think about Jerusalem and how the entire world's eyes are fixed on it. When something happens, all the cities in this world, bad things happen in those cities, but look at it. When something happens in Jerusalem, it makes national headlines. Is that true? It's a cup of trembling to the world. Jerusalem is a cup of trembling. Very prophetic. It's an ongoing prophetic verse. The cup of trembling today. That is why these are telltale signs that Jesus is getting ready to come back. Getting ready to come back. You see, the Bible tells that Jerusalem won't even be free of the trampling of the Gentiles. Luke 21 talks about, verse 24, Luke 21:24 says, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles. Trampled until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Daniel chapter 2. I don't have this one behind me, so I want you to write it down. Chapter 2, verses 36 through 45. Okay? Daniel's prophecy basically says that the Gentile dominion will not end until the Lord establishes his kingdom on this earth. This is proof. This is why I say all the Bible scholars, you're going to hear, if you just watch them on TV, you're going to hear, well, this has already been fulfilled according to the Gentiles in 1967. It's not true. There's a slim minority of people that believe like me that says, no, It's not happening. Let's look what Daniel chapter 2 even says about it. Verse 36. It says, this is the dream. Now we will tell you the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God, he was talking to Nebuchadnezzar about the dream. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. Verse 38 of Daniel 2, and wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, and he has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. But after you shall rise another kingdom, inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. I'll eventually get into the statue in Daniel. We'll talk about what these represent. It's pretty fascinating. Very end time fascinating. Verse 41, whereas you saw the feet and toes perfectly, a potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. In the days of these kings, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Its interpretation is sure. See, the kingdoms are going to be going on. Gentile kingdoms are going to be going on until the kingdom that lasts forever comes. That's proof that the Gentile dominions will be taking place over Jerusalem even until the consummation of all things, right? Zechariah behind me, chapter 12. I'm sorry, I just gave you that one. Zechariah chapter 14. This is the one I meant to say. Says this, chapter 14, verse 2. It says, for I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. So they are battling against her. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Think about that. There's going to be some serious battles taking place in this city. Half the city is going to be taken. Okay? So Zechariah the prophet sees half the city going into exile just before the Lord's return. Remember when Jesus said, run for the hills, get out of there? It's going to get bad. Now, John the Revelator, Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2 behind me. Look what it says. Here's John's observation. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. It's in Jerusalem, the temple of God. Now, if there wasn't Gentiles there, then why would he even have to worry about this? But listen to what it says. Verse 2, but leave out the outer court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles. So why does people say, well, the time of the Gentiles trampling it, it's over, it's done. That prophecy hasn't been fulfilled yet. It's ongoing. There's proof right here. That's why I close it with this verse on this particular point. It says again, verse 2, but leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles. And talking about trampling in Luke 21, listen to what it says. And they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. They're going to tread it underfoot. They're trampling it for 42 months. Guess what 42 months is? Half of the 7 years of tribulation. And it ends, the treading of the trampling of I believe will be gone at the beginning of this, trampling underfoot, because at the end of this 42 month is when Christ comes to set up his kingdom, and he saves Jerusalem through the battle of Armageddon. Does everybody understand this? This is how it happens. For 42 months, it's going to be. So when people say, "Oh, that was fulfilled," it's talking points. They're just saying, they're just spewing out what they've heard, they've learned. It's not true. It's still, this is an ongoing chapter and verse. Ongoing prophecy. And here's the proof. I gave you several places, but it says it's been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. The end of the 42 months is when Jesus comes to set up his kingdom on this earth, and he battles all the armies that are against his holy city. Okay? So trampling the outer court of the temple. This is during the Great Tribulation. Okay? The tribulation, you got half of it, and then you got the other half, which is the Great Tribulation, the latter 42 months, confirms it. But it all starts with, number 4 was what? Jerusalem would be back into Jewish hands, right? The time of the Gentiles. For God to even equivalate, make the equivalent of saying the time of the Gentiles, meaning that unbelievers would be would be trampling Jerusalem. Trampling it from whom? Jerusalem's all. Now, understand what I'm about to say. I don't want you to get lost in my translation of it. But Jerusalem's always been, through history, throughout most history, has been given to the Gentiles. They owned it. So why would that? None of these verses would even be important in Luke 21 and Revelation 11. It wouldn't even be important unless it says that it would be given to the Gentiles to trample underfoot. Okay? They don't own it. They're just trampling underfoot. They're polluting it. That must mean that the Jews own it. It's back in their possession. That happened in 1967. So it is correct about 1967. It's the Six-Day War being fulfilled, and they took back Old Jerusalem, okay? They took back Old Jerusalem. Now let's look at, we're about done. Let's look at, I don't even know if I should get into this late. What's that? Yeah, it's 8:15. Let's pick up next week with part 3. Next week, I'm going to start we're going to start out talking about Magog and Gog and why that is really important right now, speaking this week. Very important.